I'll have to tell you sometime about my short interview on BBC Radio about cool. Professor Liu, what is cool? So I went on for about 5 minutes, my given time, about knowledge work and information technology and corporations and larger issues today. Long pause. No, we meant who would be cooler than Steve McQueen? Like Doctor Who's TARDIS, this talk is dimensionally transcendental, bigger on the inside than on the outside, for those of you who know the series in its many incarnations. Originally written as the introduction to the forthcoming Blackwell Companion to Digital Literary Studies, which is edited by Ray Siemens and Susan Schreibman. They're announcing it for the end of this year. My talk's outer or framing topic is digital literary studies. To address that specific topic, however, I developed within its frame a more general inner topic, which I'm now considering working up into a short book. I like it better than the other topic. That topic is what I'm calling the new media encounter. Perhaps the best way to characterize the field of digital literary studies today is to say that its scholars, theorists, and creative writers together narrate a scene of new media encounter, in this case between the literary and the digital. The underlying premise is that the boundary between codex-based literature and digital information has now been so breached by shared technological, communicational, and computational protocols that we're well past thinking about borders. We're into the zone of encounter. And new media is the concept that helps organize our understanding of how to negotiate, which is to say, mediate the mixed protocols of that encounter zone. But if digital literary studies is an account of new media encounter, then it also belongs to a long lineage of such first contact narratives in media history. New media, it turns out, is a very old tale. Before turning specifically to digital literary studies, then, I think it's necessary to step into the TARDIS to review, as if in a time machine, the generic features of that tale. There are more and less capable imaginations of the new media encounter moment, and it's important to be able to tell the difference before attending to today's tale of digital literary studies. This is from Marcia McLuhan, The Medium is the Message. Leonard Doob, in his report, Communication in Africa, tells of one African who took great pains to listen each evening to the BBC News, even though he could understand nothing of it. Just to be in the presence of those sounds at 7 p.m. each day was important for him. In the 17th century, our ancestors still shared this native's attitude to the forms of media. No new media experience, it seems, is fully imaginable without the help of what might loosely be called narratives of new media encounter, such as this Caliban moment of media enchantment, media colonization in McLuhan's essay. Whether told from the perspective of the native of old media or the ambassador of new media, such tales are a staple of epochs undergoing media change. Two other paradigmatic examples are Plato's myth in the Phaedrus of the inventor of writing giving his, I guess we should call it demo, and Claude Lévi-Strauss's tale in his Tristes Tropiques of the writing lesson. This is from Plato. But when they came to letters, this, said Thuth, will make the Egyptians wiser and give them better memories. It's a specific both for the memory and for the wit. Thamus replied, O most ingenious Thuth, the parent or inventor of an art is not always the best judge of the utility or inutility of his own inventions to the users of them. And in this instance, you who are the father of letters, from a paternal love of your own children, have been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory but to reminiscence, and you give your disciples not truth but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having a show of wisdom without reality. It's a very well-known passage. And Lévi-Strauss, the juxtaposition of these two passages is really quite interesting if you follow the segue from the show of wisdom or the semblance of truth. I handed out sheets of paper and pencils, At first, they did nothing with them. Then one day I saw that they were all busy drawing wavy horizontal lines. I wondered what they were trying to do, then was suddenly borne upon me that they were writing, or to be more accurate, were trying to use their pencils in the same way as I did mine. The majority did this and no more, but the chief had further ambitions. No doubt he was the only one who had grasped the purpose of writing. So he asked me for a writing pad, and when we both had one and were working together, if I asked for information on a given point, he did not supply it verbally, but drew wavy lines on his paper and presented them to me as if I could read his reply. One might also think of such similar cross-historical pairings as Augustine's account of coming upon Ambrose engaged in the new practice of silent reading. Quote, "When we came to see him, we found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud," close quote. And W.J.T. Mitchell's recent pedagogical exemplum of what he calls showing seeing, a simulation of new media contact in which, quote, "I asked the students to frame their presentations by assuming that they are ethnographers who come from and are reporting back to a society that has no concept of visual culture. Visual culture is thus made to seem strange, exotic, and in need of explanation," close quote. Many more instances, I think, could be cited, and indeed narratives of new media encounter in the form of first contact with the word, book, law, image, music, and more recently code, are deeply embedded in the entire historiography of early modern religious or imperial conquest, Enlightenment and industrial modernization, 20th century control through communication twinned with mass entertainment, and post-industrial informating or knowledge work, picking up phrases from various critics in the background here. It might be hypothesized that all major changes in the social cultural order are channeled symbolically, if not also instrumentally, through narratives of media change, to the point, indeed, that such narratives often take on the significance of conversion experiences. New media encounters are a proxy wrestle for the soul of the person and the civilization. Augustine's conversion, "Take it and read," the child sings nearby in one of history's most potent stagings of random access reading, is not unique in this regard. Dramatizations of the instant when individuals, villages, or nations first wrap their minds around a manuscript, book, telephone, radio, TV, computer, cell phone, iPod, and so on, are overdetermined. McLuhan spoke of electric media as if it were the incandescent star of a new nativity, and adepts of digital media today reverence the born digital, they call it, with something of the conviction of the born again. Or more accurately, conversion connotes too right-angled a change. The better term is indeed, I think, encounter, indicating a thick, unpredictable zone of contact, more borderland than borderline, where understandings and, yes, also misunderstandings of new media are negotiated along twisting, partial, and contradictory vectors. We might think here of Jean-Francois Lyotard's notion of the pagus in classical times, the tricky frontier around a town where one deals warily with strangers, because even the lowliest beggar may turn out to be a god, or vice versa. So this is Lyotard. Pagus is a place where one compacts with something else. It's a place of boundaries. Boundaries are not borders. It's a place of ceaseless negotiations and ruses, which means that there's no reference by which to judge the opponent's strength. One does not know if she's a god or a human. It is a beggar, but it may be a god. Adapting Lyotard's concept, we may say that media contact zones are a pagus. New media are always pagan media, strange, rough, and guileful, either messengers of the gods or spam. Narratives of new media are thus less objective accounts than appropriate to the ruses of the pagus, speculative bargaining positions. Encountering a new medium, one says in essence, what do I get if I deal with this as if it were really a scroll, book, TV, phone, radio, or surveillance instrument, and so on, in disguise? In addition, since any speculation has its risk-averse side, narratives of new media encounter are also in part conservative. Like photographic vignettes in the 19th century, they have rounded gradient contours that blur the raw edge of new media into the comfort zone of existing technosocial constraints, expectations, and perceptions. At once descriptive and interpretive, speculative and wary, proselytizing and critical, visionary and regulatory, narratives of new media encounter, I think, are the elementary form of media theory, the place from which all meta-discourse about media starts. Or again, they're intradiscursive, part of the self-mediating discourse or feedback by which media ecologies, as they've recently been called, adapt systemically when new forces swarm across the border. The above overview of how cultures tell themselves about new media would in a larger treatment invite more detailed, historically organized evidence, although I promised myself that this will be a short book. But on the present occasion, I will focus synoptically on the basic logic of such tellings. The following 4 propositions outline something like what I think to be the overall genome of the new media encounter, particular features of which may dominate or recede in any particular instance. Proposition 1, narratives of new media encounter are identity tales in which media at once projects and interjects otherness. At the end of his borrowed anecdote of the African listening to the BBC, you'll recall, McLuhan concludes, in the 17th century, our ancestors still shared this native's attitude to the forms of media. Even as he projects the otherness of new media onto the cultural other, he interjects that otherness into the cultural self. It's really the Westerner, genealogically the Renaissance man, who passes as African. A similar identity chiasmus can be detected in other rehearsals of new media encounter. Mitchell's Seeing, for example, requires students to imagine exotic others, but also to exoticize themselves. The general function of any narrative of new media encounter, we may say, is to depict new media as a perpetual stranger, or, Paki, Lyotard, pagan in our own midst. Such a mirror moment participates in the broader logic of cultural and interpersonal encounters, which are meaningful only to the extent that the self, at least for one piercing moment, becomes other to itself. Proposition 2, narratives of new media encounter implot their identity tale as a life cycle of media change. The 3 primary moments in this life cycle, the building blocks of the new media narrative, I think, are the following. Media enchantment, colonization. Again, what I call McLuhan's Caliban moment is instructive. In the media studies field, the mysterious process of enchantment, colonization that brings the African under the spell of the Prospero BBC goes by the name of media determinism. For better or worse, media changes us. We are changelings of media. Media disenchantment. This is the moment of critique or of resistance. One thinks, for example, of the sly way in which the tribal chief in Levi-Strauss's anecdote beards the anthropologist while pretending to be able to write. Levi-Strauss, this farce went on for 2 hours. Was he perhaps hoping to delude himself? More probably, he wanted to astonish his companions, to convince them that he was acting as an intermediary agent for the exchange of goods, that is, as media, that he was in alliance with a white man and shared his secrets. We were eager to be off, so I did not try to explore the matter further. Here, the anthropologist's question, was he perhaps hoping to delude himself, has a curious self-canceling logic, since it's hard to conceive of intentional self-delusion without undermining the meaning of intent, and varying from ethnography into psychoanalysis. This strange question is an indicator that something odd is happening in experience of media during the contact moment. The native is not just enchanted with new media, deluded, quote unquote, by its magical illusion, but able to see through the magic to its reality, which turns out to be the same old of social power. Quote, more probably he wanted to astonish his companions, close quote. The Caliban moment collapses into the Machiavellian moment. Media enchantment entails disenchantment and ultimately resistance or appropriation. The Frankfurt School of critique of the media culture industry is paradigmatic, as is also a more recent critique of the same industry by the conservative right. In the case of Levi-Strauss's anecdote, the now canonical rebuttal from a disenchanted viewpoint is Derrida's discussion of the writing lesson in Tristes Tropiques, tinged, one might think, by Derrida's own neo-Caliban childhood as an Algerian Jew during the run-up to World War II. Media enchantment, media disenchantment, that seems to be a closed circuit. So I will add a third moment in the life cycle of the new media encounter that breaks that binary impasse. Media surmise. I take the word surmise from the last line of Keats' trans or metacolonialist sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Cortez stared at the Pacific while all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. But my thought is borrowed more approximately from such recent media theorists as Matthew Fuller, who sees in such media as pirate radio, quote, ways in which hidden dimensions of invention and combination are embedded and implicit in particular dynamics and affordances of media systems and their parts, close quote. And Ronald Dibert, whose analysis of media ecology, as he calls it, supposes the opposite of media determinism. Quote, once introduced, a technology becomes part of the material landscape in which human agents and social groups interact, having many unforeseen effects, close quote. The basic idea is that media, as befits a creature of the Pegasus, are wily. Indeed, the very uncertainty of singular versus plural media, which comes into the English language about the year 1960 to 65 or so, is to the point. Media are not a monolithic one-way determinism, but a buzzing, unpredictable ecology. There are niches for both the established media aggregators, church, state, broadcast or cable TV, Microsoft, Google Search, YouTube, iTunes, etc., and newer species, aka startups, that launch in local niches with underestimated general potential. In the 18th century, after all, the novel was a startup. Proposition 3, the life story of the new media encounter plays out in the key registers of human significance, at least 3 that I can think of. Historical. The very phrase new media, of course, stages an exaggerated encounter between old and new. No media change, it seems, is imaginable without staging such a temporal encounter, where the bias usually inclines toward a la mode. This means that narratives of new media are ipso facto narratives of modernization, whether configured as Enlightenment progress, modernist differentiation, that is the specialization of once unified cultural sensibilities and institutions into bureaucratically insulated functions requiring mediation, post-industrial disruption, as in Joseph Schumpeter's economic model of creative destruction, or globalization, today's amalgam of all those effects above. Social-political. Since new media and counter-narratives are modernization narratives, they're also big with all the analyses and ideologies of social identity that have attended the Western understanding of modernization, from the Enlightenment through at least the apparent convergence of neoliberalism and neoconservatism that Francis Fukuyama, in the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, famously called the end of history. We need not review the extensive literature on the modernizing social effects of the invention of print, for example, to identify the westernizing post-Enlightenment social program behind such more recent new media claims as information wants to be free, the internet is decentralized, or most recently, Web 2.0 equals collective intelligence and the rule of many. Social political claims about new media inherit a long-standing assumption that media reconfigures one-to-many and many-to-many relations through what McLuhan described as, quote, the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology, close quote. Racial, gender, class, age, and other social relations also figure in representations of new media encounter, including, as the work of such critics as Wendy Chun, Jennifer Gonzalez, and Lisa Nakamura argues, those specifically focus on encountering the cultural other in the digital new world. And subjective, meaning cognitive, psychological, psychosomatic, phenomenological, personal, all that fuzzy mess there. Here it's useful to recall the full context of the McLuhan dictum about the new scale and extension of ourselves. The canonical passage is from the beginning of The Medium is the Message. In a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a means of control, it's sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message, This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any new medium, that is of any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. The personal and social, that's a really typical McLuhan doublet, almost a hendiadys for the impact of new media. New media may be collective social cultural experience, but it is also psychologically, corporeally, phenomenologically, and subjectively personal at the same time. As McLuhan put it in soundbite form, in his collaboration with graphic designer Quentin Fiore, the medium is the massage, sometimes pronounced the medium is the mass age. Electric circuitry, an extension of the central nervous system, media, by altering the environment, evoke in us unique ratios of sense perceptions. The extension of any one sense alters the way we think and act, the way we perceive the world. When these ratios change, men change. And you'll note the equivocation between the central nervous system inside the brain and the great, gigantic plural we that the passage ends upon. We see similar telescopings between collective and personal ratios in accounts of new media as old as Plato's Phaedrus, where the Egyptian king foresees the total effect of writing on his people in internalizing psychological terms. Quote, they will not use their memories, they will trust in the external written characters and not remember of themselves. Similarly, accounts of so-called Web 2.0 today turn upon paradigmatic examples such as MySpace.com, which is both social networked, as you know, and intensely personal at the same time in some odd contradictory blend. Proposition 4. When fully realized in their historical, social-political, and personal entanglements, the identity tales created by narratives of new media encounter, I think, are unpredictable, and that's really what I want to emphasize today. The real interest in narratives of new media encounter, the underlying reason I describe them in such unmoored terms as borderlands, otherness, or surmise, is that the historical, social-political, and subjective registers of media identity I've mentioned are not just neutral substrates like pure silicon on which programs of determinism and resistance run. Instead, they are doped with human contingencies that switch, bend, refract, refocus, and otherwise mediate the very experience of media in ways that kink any too easy plot of old to new, centralized to decentralized, or embodied to televirtual. While narratives of new media encounter are modernization narratives, alternative visions of modernity and its complex identities do emerge from it. The weaker form of this thesis may be put this way. New media encounters are really messy. Messy means, Lisa Gittleman has a nice term for it. She says they are muddy. Messy means that right-angled historical, social-political, or psychological distinctions between old and new media typically do not survive concrete acts of narration. Instead, binary distinctions open out into overlapping, contradictory, or otherwise thick affordances between media regimes. Raymond Williams' argument about coexisting residual dominant and emergent social forces, though not specifically about media, is kind of a tutor text here. Equally suggestive are many intellectual models of messy cultural transition, ranging, for example, from Fernand Brauddel's layered historiography of long, intermediate, and short durations, to Frederick Jameson's forthrightly untidy definition of the transition from modernism to postmodernism as a reshuffling of emphases enacted in what I've always been fascinated by, which is Frederick Jameson's highly messy prose style, which somehow breaks into clarity at the pivotal moments. Well worth, I think, a formalist study in itself. In formal studies of media, such messiness characteristically surfaces in the recognition that media shifts have their full impact only after very long temporal and institutional lags of indirection when nobody knows exactly what's going on. Thus, historians of writing demonstrate that multiple generations were needed to convert oral peoples into people who thought in terms of writing, who could read silently, for example. So too, as M.T. Clancy shows in his book From Memory to Written Record, England, 1066 to 1307, the introduction of writing only became socially meaningful through the massive accretion of centuries of institutions, practices, forms, and technologies that scaled up the initial invention into a cultural force, as in the case of the proliferation of documents in the centuries that he covers. But there's also a strong version of this thesis that will provide an appropriately dramatic finish to my synopsis of the new media encounter. Narratives of new media encounter are reversible. Indeed, reversibility is the fundamental reason why it's appropriate to call such narratives modally narrative, even if generically they're as diverse as anecdote, memoir, autobiography, travelogue, prophecy, critical essay, and so on. After all, deep narratives, those like tragedy that we think come near to exposing the kernel of narrative experience, do, I think, only three essential things. They expose the reversibility of the underlying relations of human reality. One thinks, for example, the antithetical claims made by collective society and personal ethics on the great, good Aeneas, who, as when he leaves Dido, can be great or good, but not both. They arbitrarily then break the symmetry of these relations to move the plot down an irreversible course. The classical authors tended to call this fate. And they then reach closure by restoring some faux equivalent of the original reversibility at a different level. For example, a marriage of opposites. In the paradigmatic Aristotelian analysis, for instance, narrative turns upon a moment of reversal, big with recognition. Protagonists and antagonists, sometimes the same as in the case of Oedipus, face off symmetrically, armed with equivalent if incommensurable claims and powers. Then the story breaks the symmetry to distribute the contested claims and powers along the irreversible time arrow so that, for example, he who was high is brought low. Yet at the end, tragedy leaves its audience haunted by a sense of transport back to the reversible crux, where eternally, it seems, fateful agony hangs in the balance. In the Shakespearean version, therefore, we leave the theater haunted by Lear's no life, because the very repetition of the question suggests that the only humanly meaningful answer to the existential binary calculation, to be or not to be, Richard II's I, no, I, is not a reckoning at all, but the suspension of decision in eternal, reversible abeyance. So too, structuralist approaches to narrative, I think, are on the same page with Aristotle. One of the key insights of Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology, for instance, is that powerful myths express the irremediable bivalence of such great existential structures of human identity as nature versus culture, hunting versus agriculture, and life versus death. Like all stories, however, myths need to break that symmetry so that life can happen. And so great warriors and brave maidens live, and then they die. Yet ultimately, myths mediate between the binaries in a way that, always with a ghostly touch of ancestors, reverts from fateful diachrony to reversible synchrony. Myths are not just about life and death, therefore, but also about how such tricksters as coyote and crow, whose animal totems split the difference between eating live and dead things, scam the normal symmetry breaking of existence. Such trickster myths, we might say, are the ancestors of media, because their constitutively human drive to mediate between polarities may well be the origin of the media drive. Media today, after all, is where dead things live on, animals act like men, the poor and the rich stars each other, and so on. All our great contemporary tricksters today are media creatures, pop idols, stars, DJs, artists, terrorists, politicians. Post-structuralism, it may be added, radicalized such mediation further as when Derrida tells tales of Western philosophy starring such typically trickster concepts as the pharmacon, poison and cure, or such trickster heroes as, well, Rousseau, Nietzsche, and so on. Or again, we might invoke an alternate tradition of thought by going back to Freud on the uncanny or unheimlich, the Freudian unhomely, as in the case of the Oedipus story that Aristotle and Levi-Strauss thought about too, is a tricky, reversible tale that at last reveals with all the shock of Aristotelian tragedy, only the homely in the strange, and the strange in the homely. The key point to take away is that narratives of new media encounter, like all narratives, have no necessary story, even if necessity is what seems to make their story go. In the narratological universe, necessity, once called fate, we call it media determinism today, does not dictate just a single plot line. Instead, necessity is better called arbitrariness or its post-structuralist equivalent, contingency. Earlier, I suggested that media stories are pagan stories. One might also, at the end of this genealogy of theoretical approaches just cited above, say with Helene Cixous that they are women's stories. I haven't thought this through fully, but it struck me recently that the kind of stories I've been talking about are a laugh of the Medusa. I know of no better messy, reversible account of the brilliant fury of media than the following passage from Cixous' essay, where I think it's possible to read not just the words voice and speech, but also body and flesh as medium. Listen to a woman speak at a public gathering. She hasn't painfully lost her wind. She doesn't speak. She throws her trembling body forward. She lets go of herself. She flies. All of her passes into her voice, and it's with her body that she vitally supports the logic of her speech. Her flesh speaks true. She lays herself bare. In fact, she physically materializes what she's thinking. She signifies it with her body. In a certain way, she inscribes what she's saying because she doesn't deny her drives, the intractable and impassioned part they have in speaking. Her speech, even when theoretical or political, is never simple or linear or objectified, generalized. She draws her story into his story. Cixous' story is also the history, or her story, of encounter, I think, with new media. In Cixous' account, even one of our oldest media, the voice, not to mention the body, or what Walter Ong calls the verbal motor drive behind the voice, is ever and again new. The laugh of the Medusa, in other words, is a laugh of media, if not also to invoke another classical woman trickster who had the last laugh, Medea. Media and gender, you see, binary logic or safe sex likes to think that these forms of intercourse between 1 and 0, men and women, are transparently, neutrally transmissive, as well as paradoxically obstructive, the ultimate rubber, not there at all, yet totally interruptive. But it turns out that our media rubbers, those tricksters, are laughing at us. Leaky and messy, their ironic contest between incorporative identity and prophylactic difference is the unpredictable zone of encounter itself. That did not make it into the introduction to the Blackwell volume. So you're getting the unexpurgated version here. Revising the historical, social, political, and subjective registers of new media encounter outlined earlier, we can now see that the effects of messiness and reversal, of insisting that there's always another plot fork in the media history, can be quite compelling. Media identity, it turns out, is manifold and dynamic. The particular messy and contrary effects I want to refer to can be captioned as follows. New media are old, but old media are new. When new media is understood to be fully embedded in history rather than as when we facilely say that, for example, the web comes after the book, then it appears to be trickily both before and after its time, both, to borrow from Peter Krapp's analysis, avant la lettre and déjà vu. The déjà vu haunting of new by old media is clear enough. The description of the World Wide Web as new media, for example, doesn't survive even an instant's examination before we discover revenants of past media. We scroll down web pages of text, photo, videos, and so on. McLuhan, and more recently J. David Bolter and Richard Gruson, get a handle on this phenomenon through the idea of remediation. According to the remediation thesis, the content of any new medium is old media. As when McLuhan says that the content of writing is speech, just as the written word is the content of print, and print is the content of the telegraph. In the digital age, when, as Lev Manovich says, we witness a, quote, second stage of media society, now concerned as much with accessing and reusing existing media objects as with creating new ones, close quote, the remediation thesis is perhaps even more in force, even if its concept needs to be updated. The container content framework was already inadequate in McLuhan's time amid the 20th century analog milieu, when formalists had made a Klein bottle out of the form content distinction. Now it's probably even more out of kilter in a digital environment that constructs both the container and the content as semi-autonomous objects whose being, resident within but not coincident with physical being, is constructed relationally as what Matthew G. Kirschenbaum in a forthcoming book, Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination, calls, and this is a nice term for it, formal materiality. Just as powerful in recent media theories has been the avant la lettre, or a thesis, or the haunting of old media by new media perspectives. I referred to the conjunction of two of the most influential research approaches in recent media studies, which is sometimes called media archaeology, as exemplified in Friedrich Kittler's and Wolf Kittler's post-McLuhan, post-Shannon, post-Turing, and post-von Neumann meditations on early media technologies, the gramophone, the typewriter, and so on. Or Lisa Gittleman and Jeffrey Pingree's collection of essays titled New Media, 1740 to 1915. Or Wendy Chun and Thomas Keenan's collection of essays titled New Media, Old Media. William Warner's research into what he terms Enlightenment New Media. Peter Kraft's research into hypertext before its time. Wolfgang Ernst's research and many other arcade media projects of this sort. The result of the media archaeology approach is that it's now difficult to imagine clicking on a typewriter or telegraph key all the way back perhaps to the silhouettes of hands on the cave walls in Chauvet, France, without envisioning a phantom relay connecting all those earlier digital manipulations with what our finger most wants to click now, which is a web link. Abstracting the logic of recent technology and generalizing it back historically, media archaeology encourages us to see old media as beta releases of computability, digitalism, random access, Turing machines, von Neumann architecture, databases, programming, hypertext, and so on. Thus, for example, it's now cliche that the I Ching, the Oulipo Group's writings, William Burroughs' cut-ups, Borges' Garden of the Forking Paths, Vannevar Bush's Memex, Ted Nelson's Xanadu, and so on are, quote-unquote, pre-hypertext. The other research approach I mentioned is history of the book, which in the aftermath of McLuhan is definitively a branch of media studies on a par with media archaeology. Leading scholars in the field, for example, include Elizabeth Eisenstein, whose The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe explicitly acknowledged the influence of McLuhan, Roger Chartier, who in recent years has increasingly juxtaposed the history of the book to studies of digital developments, or Adrian Johns, whose interest in print piracy recently sent him off to Asia to study digital piracy operations for his forthcoming book titled Piracy, Creativity, Commerce, and Crime from the Invention of Print to the Internet. The history of the book field, of course, is about the specificity of the codex, but it's also about the codex as what Walter Ong calls the technologizing of the word. The book is an early and now highly advanced media instrument. The social politics of new media cut both ways. This fact becomes clear when we realize that there's not a single modernization narrative about new media that cannot, with equal conviction and evidence, be reversed. In the case of digital media, for example, the early politically progressive narrative of that whole generation of cyber liberals, the BBS people, the early personal computer people, the others of that generation, repeated today by Web 2.0 wiki utopians, was that centralized or hierarchical information systems would cede irresistibly to hypertextuality, interactivity, peer-to-peer, or to cite the Web 2.0 mantras, open source, and collective intelligence. But in today's time of governmental and corporate information monitoring, of course, the reverse tale is just as persuasive and equally postmodern. In my Laws of Cool book, I named this contrary narrative distributed centralization, as witnessed in the implantation of dynamic packet filtering firewalls, ever more complex permission levels, increasingly rigorous and encrypted login processes, burgeoning access logs that track users by IP number or domain name, proliferating spyware and monitoring programs, and innumerable other presence points of control and accountability scattered throughout the lateral network. Such neo-authoritarian protocols are light, as when Web 2.0 proponents speak of lightweight programming models such as PHP, AJAX, and other duct tape methods that do no more really than combine proprietary data systems into bricolage mashups, making users feel that they are masters of their domain. But it's like Gulliver tied down by the light distributed threads of the Lilliputians. Leaving aside the heavies that still exist, the US National Security Agency comes to mind, today's Lilliputians are the people of standards. Open source and its credo of standards, for example, is all about this lightweight, spread out democracy, except when it is about code correctness or design correctness. So speaking from personal experience, pitting the author of an ad hoc website or blog who inserts handcrafted source code in an open source environment only to run up against the code Puritans who say, thou shalt not transgress against XHTML and CSS. As Jaron Lanier has put it in extreme form in his recent critique of the total Web 2.0 mindset, it's a nice online essay that I recommend, titled Digital Maoism, The Hazards of the New Online Collectivism. Quote, history has shown us again and again that a hive mind is a cruel idiot when it runs on autopilot. Nasty hive mind outbursts have been flavored Maoist, fascist, and religious. Close quote. The subjective experience of new media is also profoundly reversible. Now, this is a very large topic, and in order to move to the end of my talk, I'm just going to abbreviate and slice out, by way of shorthand, which is actually an apt metaphor here, one aspect of the issue that I like to call the paradox of notation versus presentation. One of the deepest problems, I think, in media history, and those of you who were at the session of the conference before this will see how this resonates off of Bertrand Gervais's talk about presence. Notation, in my usage here, denotes experiencing new media as a kind of script or programming language that needs to be mentally decoded. Presentation, by contrast, means rendering the script intuitively or immediately. Wittgenstein formulates the problem as follows in a passage that Tom Mitchell discusses at some length in his book Iconology. Quote from Wittgenstein, at first sight, a proposition, one set out on the printed page, for example, does not seem to be a picture of the reality with which it is concerned. But neither do written notes seem at first sight to be a picture of a piece of music, nor phonetic notation, the alphabet, to be a picture of our speech. And yet these sign languages prove to be pictures, even in the ordinary sense of what they represent, close quote. Improvising about Wittgenstein, how is it, for example, that sight reading changed historically from a mental contortionist act of translating alphabetic characters into oral performance into being the experience of the text? As James J. O'Donnell puts it, quote, the manuscript was first conceived to be no more than a prompt script for the spoken work, a place to look to find out what to say. The arrangement of words on the page without punctuation or word division, if you've seen very early manuscripts, was as user hostile as DOS could ever hope to be, and was meant for the technician who knew how to use it to produce the audible word, close quote. Extending the argument forward, how did proficient telegraph and punch card operators, for example, make the transition from deciphering abstract patterns of dot and dash sounds or holes to directly understanding those patterns? And bringing it up all the way to the present, how will we ever change from clumsy searching, sampling, and text or data mining to directly grokking the data patterns, for example, through new visual verbal interfaces? And this has now become a sort of paragon of these new visual verbal interfaces. Some of you may know this project. This is Bradford Paley's text arc. And what you're seeing here is the entirety of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, every single word. Although I've got to tell you that study as I might, I cannot make that mental conversion from decoding what's happening here to actually reading it in any way. It's like when I go up to Canada, I have to decode, centigrade into Fahrenheit. There are no easy answers to such questions, only better or worse descriptions of the problem. McLuhan himself tended merely to assert that new media impinged directly on the sensorium as what he called an extension of man. The post-McLuhan media archaeology and history of the book movements that I mentioned earlier are far more historically detailed, but in the end, no less purely descriptive. The great quest, really the holy grail in the landmark works of the history of the book field that I earlier mentioned, for example, by Eisenstein, Chartier, Johns, and even more recently, William St. Clair's book, The Reading Nation in the Romantic Period, is to describe how a strange alphabetic mechanical notation system became not just knowledge, but what they really wanted to find out in these works, print culture, or they call it print mentality, that is part of the core social and individual experience. Reading these works, however, one is struck by the mismatch between the intimate goal of the quest, no less than to get inside the head of media experience, and the remoteness of the available historical and statistical observational methods. It's like recent astrophysicists telling us about planets around distant stars. No one can see them, but we infer their presence through complex calculations upon intricate meshes of indirect data. Even the nuanced models and software that psycholinguists and cognitive psychologists, the astronomers you might call them of the human mind, have developed to discern which texts appear more coherent as opposed to complexly coded are in the end primarily only descriptive, as in the case of the now very influential Cometrics project, for those of you who know that software project that comes out of the University of Memphis. In all these approaches, we run up against the fact that beyond a certain point, humans are still black boxes. But instead of an explanation, media studies does have a counter-description or counter-narrative. Educators call this reverse tail critical literacy, and post-industrial business calls it knowledge work, both of which require users not just to render notation intuitively into presentation, but the exact reverse, to return presentation to the status of notation that can be thought about offline, analyzed, manipulated, and otherwise actively or critically engaged. While grade school literacy means learning to read fluently, therefore, advanced critical literacy means learning to read analytically by mentally annotating or otherwise reverse engineering presentation. The same applies to electronic and digital media. The Institute for Multimedia Literacy at the University of Southern California, for example, takes as its mission expanding, quote, the notion of literacy to include learning how to author and analyze visual, oral, dynamic, and interactive media, close quote. Of course, if the Gestalt shift from notation to presentation is a mystery, then the return from presentation to notation, I think, is too. Yet it is happening around us all the time. That's when bloggers and wikiers learn not just to envision, but to debug the code that makes the web go. So what is a good story about encountering new media? Here I'm coming to my conclusion. Well, the narrative trope thus far used in this talk has served us very well. The very direction, or rather multiple directions in which I've taken it, mean that we may now need to expand upon the narrative concept. I led off in this paper by suggesting that there are more and less capable imaginations of the new media encounter moment. In the end, imagination is a more capacious term than narrative for what's involved. For if my propositions are correct, then it follows that the best stories of new media encounter, emerging from messy, reversible entanglements with history, social politics, and subjectivity, do not go from beginning to end, and so are not really stories at all. To recur to the media ecology trope cited earlier, good narratives of new media encounter are in the end less stories than whole imaginative environments, or as I term them, borderlands of surmise. Good accounts of new media encounter imagine affordances and configurations of potentiality. We don't want a good story of new media with a punchline giving somebody the last word. We want a good world of new media that gives everyone at least one good first word, as in folksonomical tagging systems, for instance. We want a way of imagining our encounter with new media that surprises us out of the us that we thought we knew. What is the ultimate surmise projected by accounts, good accounts of new media encounter then? And here I exit my TARDIS to carry on the argument with reference to digital literary studies, my particular appointed disciplinary responsibility. The ultimate surmise imagined by accounts of new media encounter is the surmise that all people today who both love literature and practice new media, or vice versa, attempt. Here I come to my own most specific and as yet painfully unfulfilled personal mission to explore not just the general encounter with digital new media, but the encounter of literary studies with digital new media. How can literature be digital? And how can the digital, the home territory, after all, of office files, databases, and spreadsheets, as well as mass entertainment special effects, be literary? Does literature really have a future in a new media ecology where the fiercest, deepest, and most meaningful identity tales of our young people seem to be beholden to iPods and other iMedia of music, video, chat, Facebook pages, and blogs? These questions also have no easy answer. I wrote a whole book recently that started out by aiming for an answer, only to be diverted into studying the proto-aesthetic of information cool, from which I hypothesize any understanding of information answerable to my old love, literature, must eventually come. That book was also a TARDIS. I had a mission, literature and information, and I abandoned it willfully and pleasurably to explore the bigger inner problem of cool in general society. Now duty to first love calls. What really is the relation between the surmise of literature and that of new media? In lieu of a full answer, I find myself in perpetual deferral from this problem. Let me tonight conclude simply by being clear about the immense stakes involved. Let me tell an open-ended story. Once upon a time, literature in the general sense of letters was a darling of the great new medium of its time, writing, which, like any medium, organized and served as the interface between new technological, communicational, and computational protocols. Technologically, the protocol was the print codex and related forms, previously, of course, the manuscript. Communicationally, it was rhetoric, adapting to new graphic layouts. And computationally, it consisted of new logical processing apparatuses, such as tables of contents, chapter or section titles, indexes, and so on, that ramified mnemonic, analytical, and rhetorical routines, my second point is, and so on, into unsuspected new processing methods, including prototypes of what we today call searching, rapid random access, comparative reading of the Gospels, and so on. By the time literature was honed into its narrower modern sense of aesthetic discourse and post-structuralist avatars that had once stood off from infomedia, Cleanth Brooks called it heresy of paraphrase, and assimilated part of the underlying mindset of infomedia. Close reading in the new critical, structuralist or post-structuralist manners was thus not exactly the same as modern technology, communication, or computation, where not exactly the same, of course, was its pride of aesthetic difference, but it had features of all those in unsettling ways. Cutting literature off from the high-owed transcendental truths located in the divine or in the romantic self, close reading sequestered literariness in a form of internally programmed complexity that had to be processed with increasingly rigorous technical attention. In the age of modern literary close reading, all the aesthetes were secretly geeks. Today, digital is the great new medium, and as the modern to postmodern lineage I outlined just above anticipated, literature, whatever its own fastidious flirtation with brute media, is certainly not digitalism's darling. The star in the digitiverse today is media in a larger and more promiscuous sense that intermixes literature when it bothers to mention it at all with music, film, TV, animation, journalism, and so on, to concoct an evolutionary stew of hot bits fighting against and with each other to create the new media ecology. Not coincidentally, therefore, the phrase new media studies is now the title in the Academy that has won out, I think, over more general cultural and with more general cultural and theoretical cachet over such narrower phrases rooted in specific disciplines as the digital humanities, humanities computing, electronic arts, electronic literature, or computer-mediated communications. New media is the concept under which we now organize and interface with the current configuration of technology, communication, and computation. Yet, to keep the story open-ended, all the while the question of imagination has been left open like a vulnerable port in a firewall through which literature might still hack its way. Of course, imagination is a distinctively romantic phrasing. The Aeolian harp that exercised Coleridge's and Percy Shelley's imagination, perhaps, was really a special kind of algorithmic computational instrument on a par with the Babbage machines and Jacquard looms of the time, ancestral to the digital computer. Let me generalize, therefore, by reaching back all the way to classical literary roots. Let me designate imagination poiesis in the sense of the original concept of poiesis, meaning both the blended techne and an aesthetic making, generative together, of surmise. Poiesis is not the same as technology, communication, or computation, but it combines all these means of experience making to imagine the identity tales, tragic, utopian, or messily mixed, that mediate us in relation to the others who are part of our generative kernel. We need today, I think, a poiesis of digital literary studies, able to imagine how old and new media, literary media together allow us to imagine. In such a poetics, everything old and new is again up for grabs as we negotiate the contact zone between such paired terms as the following. We thought we knew what writing means, but now encoding makes us wonder, and vice versa. So too reading and browsing, as well as related activities like searching, data mining, and data visualization, destabilize each other. The same applies to all the other pairs in this list and many other terms that could be added here. The task of studying new media, it might be said, is to help us better understand what it meant to write, read, and imagine in the past, while inversely, that of studying old media is to help us appreciate what it now means to encode, browse, simulate, etc. Digital literary studies should make that possible. We are always mediated creatures, and as such, are fully alive in culture when old and new media, the ancestors and children of our self-images, collaborate to allow us to encounter the imagination that we could be other. I close there. Or perhaps pass the microphone around.
Actually, my passage to the microphone has everything to do with my question. The question is that the notion of the encounter in your talk, at best, has to do with stasis, with sort of the stopping, if you will, to encounter some kind of, and at worst has to do with, or ignores, the questions, or takes seriously the questions of space, and particularly mobility. And so there is such an emphasis in your own narrative and in your explanation of what narrative is on temporality and on history, on the new media is old and the old media is new, that it seems to me that what washes out of all of those 14 dimensions or points that you want to emphasize, the transmission, migration are two of them. But that it seems to me that in some ways the digitalization of media, of the media encounter, is one that in some ways has to does take account in some versions of the question of mobility, of differential mobilities, of the questions of physical access to that place where it is that one encounters media in particular contingent, specific kinds of ways. So I'm wondering, what you might have to say about that.
I have a few things I can think of to say about that. I think here it's partly a matter of vocabularies here, which actually are in almost their entirety overlapping, but not exactly the same here. So in my imagination of the media encounter moment, there's another passage in the Medium as a Message essay by Marshall McLuhan, in which he alludes to Forster's passage to India, in which part of the encounter moment has to do with that imagination and realization of the tremendous distance that has had to be traversed from the first world to the third world at that time here, and the newness that comes with that distance here. I think you're probably quite right that my own imagination of the media encounter moment is primarily biased toward a temporal vocabulary here. This has to do with the long-standing preoccupation in my work from the New Historicism days on through the contemporary instant-on era of information with the role for historical awareness or consciousness today. Nevertheless, I think that we're roughly speaking about the same thing, because as I imagine it, the media encounter zone is a zone and not a borderline. It's a zone in the sense that it is a location or space in which there is a tremendous mobility of roles, positions, stances, and attitudes toward the other, a negotiation, an effort to trick or to ruse or in some other way to get around or to work around this new form that you don't quite understand here. So if you're in a space that is a zone of mobile negotiations of that sort, I naturally begin to talk in temporal terms as a way to describe provisionality, a certain state of contingency, that nothing lasts forever, but is merely a temporary guise or form. Yes?
That it seems that this problem would be solved very easily, perhaps by the inclusion of the work of Doreen Massey, who talks about the new encounter in a very different spatial way than is done by other work before, and that she, in her book, is it Fourth Space, I think it's called, where she looks at how new media, or not new media, she looks at how first encounters are always described in terms of the first world moving through space, moving through time, getting to the third world, who have sort of been static and out of time. And she proposes instead a sort of redescription of that encounter as two different sorts of spaces and times. And she actually goes and looks at maps and drawings that came out of first encounters that represent some of the sort of collisions of space and time there. Yeah. And I think that might offer a sort of help to sort of providing the sort of space that would articulate, I think, what you did describe in your talk as a more complex set of negotiations than I presume solely a colonial nature of that encounter.
Yeah, that's very nice. Thank you for that. And in my own talk here, the one sort of a part of that kind of research that I do make use of is sort of anthropological approaches to prehistoric cultures, as they're called. When you think about mythic time, and of course this is a long-standing controversy or debate about Levi-Strauss's structuralist approach to prehistorical cultures here, you do tend to think of a different kind of time, a kind of a reversible time. And I'm trying to recuperate from that or appropriate from that structuralist notion of time, that notion of reversibility, and make it tell upon a certain kind of mobility or contingency today. Not stasis captured in a perpetual past, in other words, but a kind of ever mobile awareness of contingency. Hi, Wendy.
First, thank you for a really provocative and wonderful talk. Thinking about this question of space, it struck me that you were gesturing towards it when you were talking about ecology. And ecology as being fundamentally spatial. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the relationship between encounter and ecology, partly because I must say I have some reservations about the notion of media ecology. And this is partly because I'm married to an ecologist. Yeah. And I think that this sort of romanticization of ecology, or the talking about ecology as if it wasn't fundamentally based on economics and notions of competition, and in many ways denying the sort of surprise or imagination or encounter, is something that I think needs to be developed. But I thought by putting together the encounter with ecology, or displacing those two terms together, I think you were gesturing towards something really interesting.
Yeah, I've got a lot more to say about the notion of ecology as it's been mapped over the media sphere today here. There is a danger, as you put it, of romanticizing the notion of ecology when you use it that way, and the danger might be put in this fashion. Whereas people used to be suspicious of or critique the notion of a media determinism, it may very well be that the media ecology notion merely substitutes for media determinism, media organism here, that there's a kind of evolving, almost bottom-up evolution of media forces here, unconscious of the fact in making that thesis that media creatures are not creatures in any primary sense. They only come alive when somebody actually uses them. So there needs to be an agent behind their agency in some way. This is part of a larger suspicion I have about the romanticization of emergence and complexity theory today. The whole sort of topsy-turvy mode of explanation we now have for events that are very complex and that therefore cannot be explained at a top level, that need to be explained in terms of a whole that is called ecology or environment of complex bottom-up agent-like actions at the bottom here. I'm a little bit suspicious that in the epistemological leap between levels in the emergence argument, we lose sight of what actually matters to us in the notion of agency here. If you cede or outsource agency too far down the ladder, you lose the ability to actually explain what matters to us in agency here. So what I'm hearing in your critique of my, a borrowed usage of media ecology here is we can't just sit back at a distance and say, these are sort of abstract artificial life forms that are evolving here. You have to really see these as human beings using these life forms in a complex way, and thus as not just evolutionary encounters, but as I put it in one of my passages, a sort of Machiavellian encounters of different kinds.
So given that the sociopolitics of media cuts both ways, does that mean that ethical design of computer applications and new media is doomed? Because whenever you try and do something good, it's going to cut back the other way?
Well, historically, that has been the case with hacker culture, right? So as we know, and who was the man who brought down that famous hacker, Kevin Mitnick? I can't remember his name. He's a Japanese-American. He wrote a book on this topic here. He's got some wonderful passages in that book which try to recover the usage of the term hacker today and bring it back to its early root in sort of graduate student computer science, graduate student culture, in which hacker was a sort of white hat term. It meant being able to work in a clever and work-around fashion, sort of like those pagans I was talking about earlier, in order to be able to communicate in a trust community from machine to machine here. Of course, the tragedy of that term hacker is that it got turned around, right, so that the black hats became more powerful than the white hats, that is the evil hacker here, leading to this kind of a resurgence in the other direction by which corporations try to hire the black hat hackers in order to make them work for the forces of good. Again, the bottom line here is, again, very much like the last point we were just talking about, which is that you cannot ultimately divorce media from its usages. And I think that means you have to bring users into play here somewhere along the way and their motives. You don't have mobility unless you have motive power of one sort or another. And to explain motive power, we have a whole apparatus that we call ethics, politics, and so on, about human motivations and so on. Okay. Yes.
Would it be easier to just pass this back to people, perhaps? This is kind of a general question, and it's about the relationship between your analysis of new media studies and let's call it broadly science studies, which would take into account the problems of, particularly what I'm concerned about is technology transfer, because there's obviously an element of different technologies in old and new, and particularly if we think in terms of technology encounters in terms of cultural difference, we tend to, I think, look at that old and new narrative in overdetermined ways, very Eurocentric, overdetermined ways, which starts with, I think Eisenstein starts incorrectly in the 16th century, but really starts over the last 200 years and goes forward. And there are clearly other models of technology and other models of inscriptive technologies in different cultures, and I think the overdetermined version of this would be the notion that China and Japan are modernizing on a Western model, which is not the view you get if you talk to scholars in China and Japan. So that's kind of a broad question, but I'm wondering what your response would be.
I think my response would be that it really matters what your historical frame or period is. If you take the historical framework back far enough, the picture looks very different. That book by the medievalist that I mentioned in my talk by M.T. Clancy, and I forgot the exact title of the book now, but it's about England from the 10th through the 13th centuries. is very apropos in this regard. In that light, the inscriptive technologies of England were highly crude and primitive by comparison with the new Eastern sources of inscriptive technologies. So, for example, paper and so on, highly protected and elite forms of technology coming from another part of the world here. So it partly matters how far back you go in time. Hi, Lisa.
Alan, I just have a kind of silly and quotidian question inviting your speculation. I taught a course that I called Intro to New Media in 2003. Then I changed it to Critical Internet Studies. Then I changed it back to, now I'm going to change it back to Intro to New Media. And so I see how, I agree with you when you say that new media is the term of art to describe what we're doing. And I'm wondering about how that happened, because it seemed like for several years around the turn of the century, every lecture about new media began, and the new media won't be new media anymore. And it's a term that's designed to self-destruct, as was postmodernism. My undergrads or grads would always ask, so what's going to happen after postmodernism? It's a logical question. And indeed, it just disappeared. You know, it did have a limited lifespan because the term wasn't designed to do anything but signify an after. But why is it that new media has been so durable? Critical internet studies I got rid of because eventually I wasn't just talking about the internet, and it did seem to be somewhat inaccurate. Because of different types of convergence and so on, it seemed not right. So I went back to new media studies, but why is it that new media studies has survived despite all these predictions of its demise year after year? I mean, as a term, not as a practice or as a thing.
My personal opinion is, and I say this with all the respect in the world, that it's the artist's fault. So the explanation for this goes something like this. There's a general and a specific formulation here. The general formulation goes all the way back to the first question about time and mobility and so on. You know, ironically, it's not the quote-unquote primitives who are caught in a static world. It's we moderns who are caught in a static world. Ever since at least the avant-garde, right? We've been stuck in the perpetual moment of the new here. We get into something new and we can never get out of the newness of that new. Again, it petrifies us. Joanna Drucker has a nice, interesting book out in the last year or so. You may have seen it. It's called Sweet Dreams, I think it's called. It's her critique of the avant-garde thesis, which hangs on by hook or by crook in at least academic art history here as the perpetual stance of the artist, even though the actual artists, according to Johanna, have gone on to something else here. So it's we who are petrified in a static moment of time here. And part of the incentive behind my notion of the encounter in this paper is to recover from other societies a different mobility of time that may shake up this notion of the new. My emphasis is on the new as reversible, that is, unstable in some way rather than petrified in some way. So that's the general formula. We are stuck in the new, and I think it's the artists who are mainly to blame here, not that the humanists and others don't have their role to play as well. But in the last, I'd say 5 to 6 years, the really most vigorous, most robust, most interesting people working in new media, I think, myself, both practically and critically as well, have been people from the media arts part of the world here, as opposed to that earlier generation of hypertext fiction writers and poets and so on here. So all these artists came in. My own institution, we brought in 6 or 7 new media artists, Georgia Grady, Lisa Jabrat, and others. They're doing tremendously interesting work. So now how do you fit their kind of work in with things that we used to call hypertext and humanities computing and linguistic computing and text parsing and so on? You don't. You can only bring it in by means of this rubric, which the humanities have learned to begin to appreciate, which is the media rubric. It seems to provide a big enough tent that we can actually get the artists in talking together with the text-based people here. So it's the artist's fault. Yes.
Oh, hi, I loved your talk. It was very inspiring, and it really actually touched on a lot of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. So now I feel that everything I will say will be a modest footnote to your talk. But I wanted to.
There's that butt.
that
I just
butt.
love there.
No, I'm very sincere, but well, I want to follow up on that question, because I think that the reason that the new media has so much resilience, that the artists have succeeded in making that field visible and creative and sort of erratic, but that I think it's very much a kind of corporate and neoliberal discourse, and that in the fields of research and practice, you can now only get funding if you're working with new media. And therefore, every time that artists and scholars and critics get funding for their work in developing the most current, the most at the edge of new media, it becomes a kind of performance of the point that you're making, which is that what's pushing the new media is the artists. But in my institution and in many places that I know of, if you're doing research, if you're an artist, if you're a curator, you only get money if you use that phrase.
Oh, there's
new media.
there's the other magic word there. The two magic words in that wonderful statement
But I think it's
are
an
money
important.
and media. Right?
I
So-
think it's an important point to make, not only because it's a pragmatics, but because from a theoretical point of view, you talked about, the muddiness of new media encounters, and I agree that, these situations are extremely complex, and that determination is and that, there's a lot going on there. But you need to balance that against the other point that you made, which is if you downsource agency too far down the chain, you're missing what matters. And part of what matters right now for people like us who work in the university is to be very, very careful about how much this coercion of criticism and practice towards the newest of new technologies is undermining our abilities to be autonomous and critical in relation to that muddy field.
Okay, that's a wonderful comment here, and it leads to very deep waters, muddy waters here, indeed. How to put this? I want to start with your invocation of neoliberalism here, because I think it's exactly on target here. We were earlier talking about media determinism and about the need to get out of the framework of thinking about media as its own agency here. Well, the great media in this regard, from the neoliberal perspective, is money, right? And a great new media encounter is the encounter with a money or capitalist market here. We tend to say things in a neoliberal way today of the sort that sounds especially similar to media determinism. That is, it is money that is doing this. It's a free market that is doing this. It is the global economy that dictates certain things occur in a certain kind of way. That's the kind of outsourcing of agency, right? It's no one in particular doing these things, no one in particular that has a motivation for that kind of mobility that we call the global economy today. We sort of outsource it down the ladder of agents to these media/money forms of one sort or another. So I buy all of that. That makes perfect sense to me, that when we're talking about the new media encounter and we're talking about modernization, we are talking about the rise of capitalist economies of one sort or another. Where I sort of draw the line, however, or of difference between your comment and my perspective is the thesis, which I may be mishearing, I'm not sure, that we need to, as humanists and academics, to sort of maybe draw back from that or resist that. We've already sold out. That's my view of this. That is, there's a long-standing, deep and complicitous relationship between contemporary styles of capitalism, late capitalism, corporate capitalism, and academic modes of research and knowledge. We tend to think of things and evaluate them, we valorize interdisciplinarity, we valorize a whole host of issues that have uncannily similar analogs in the corporate world, the teamwork, for example, and other forms of knowledge like that. So I've been thinking for a long time about this strange encounter zone, really, between the corporate world and the academic world today. We borrow their technologies and knowledges, and they borrow right back from us. And which is the chicken or the egg?
Blame a little as the artist. I teach in a practice-based new media program. Ryan and I do here, and one of the things that we struggle with, and I know a lot of new media programs do, is that we cannot seem to wrest control of acquisition of equipment free of the administrative function of the institution and into the pedagogical function of the institution. So in fact, the newest thing in the building is always a piece of equipment, not an idea. And so these things land there, the students are sort of moving around it, and we have to teach to it. And that's the way pedagogy is determined in this area.
So there the historical question is, in what ways that situation is different from the past, right? Here's this new technology, here's this new thing called a book. Now let's invent a pedagogy that allows us to teach around it. By the way, speaking of new media encounters, I've got a very interesting series of courses that I'm working up in pilot form this year. It's a variant off of Tom Mitchell's long-standing media course at Chicago, where, as I cited earlier, he has that showing seeing assignment where you have to put yourself out of your comfort zone of media to do something. This is a set of courses that I'm calling Literature Plus. And the students read works such as Franco Moretti's Graphs, Maps, and Trees. They read Katie Salen's book on game design fundamentals. They read Willard McCarty's book, Humanities Computing, which is all about modeling and so on. And the quarter-long assignment for the course is that you are to take a literary work and do something significant with it by the end of the quarter that is not literary interpretation. So I'm forcing the students to make a map or make a model or make a game or do an artist representation or do something outside their comfort zone and outside their media comfort zone as well, in the hopes, this is a speculation, that there's something to be gained by moving us outside our little home territory in that practical kind of way.
With that homework assignment for all of you, I'd ask you to join me in thanking Alan.
Thank you.